Very good. So welcome to our penultimate class. Um, and this one is on Jewish community, conversion, movement, synagogue life, and so on. And let's see, someone whose name I don't recognize is joining. Let's see who that is. Oh, hello. I didn't recognize your name, Dinsat. You don't look like a Dinsat. He's just connecting to audio. Okay. So the discussion tonight is on Jewish community, conversion movement, synagogue life, and so on. And I know that I've circulated to the group this discussion of the final exam. And basically, for those of you that want kind of an official record of your participation, for some of you that's important in conversion. For others, you may just like certificates, and I can meet both sets of interests. So for that, if you're interested, uh, please take the final exam. And then I think I said something like 80% participation. Um, and you can make up classes. And I think what I recommended to someone is if you view these videos on YouTube, just put in a comment that, I was here or something so I can, I'm not being very rigorous about checking this if you don't have the 80%. And if you have any questions, get back to me. The exam is pretty simple. Make it brief. The only thing, I'm glad I have this opportunity. You may not recognize this word berit. It's just another way of writing in English letters brit, which means covenant in Ashkenazi pronunciation, bris. Travis.
I'm trying to keep mine pretty brief, but there's some areas that it's very difficult. I mean, how long is too long?
I've actually never done this before.
Oh, okay.
I've learned this from Rabbi Singer, and I think it's worth doing something. But you know, I the goal is to be brief. What can I say?
Okay.
Whatever you write, I will read.
Okay.
But I'm not. Basically, I just want to have a sense that you've been coming to classes, and even and that you know how to find these kinds of materials on the web, so that that you can make use of the information that we've discussed. Okay, so we're going to begin by discussing conversion in our little conversion group that we have on Thursday night. Um, we discussed this a lot, and I think I've even mentioned it when we first began our classes. Uh, Traditionally, Jews don't seek converts, um, and I always like to quote my rabbi, Rabbi Alan Greenbaum, who said Judaism is the one true religion for Jews. Judaism doesn't teach that you have to be Jewish to get any of the benefits of the world to come or whatever. It is our tribe. And indeed, in ancient times, it was a tribe, and it wasn't clear you could join. So in one of the books, the book of Ruth, there is a story which looks and sounds a lot like conversion. And because Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, discourages Ruth and her sister from joining her 3 times, to develop the rabbinic tradition of discouraging potential converts 3 times. And I always, in the first class, I always say, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. That's the 3 times. One of the things the Reform movement did some time ago is to make it clear that we welcome converts. That although we're not out there seeking converts, we are definitely not out there discouraging converts. And this will be old news to most of you. In order to convert, there is a course of study, which this is part of, and then there is a Beit Din. And when you're thinking of a Beit Din, you may be thinking of these guys, but in fact, it looks more like this is actually 2 rabbis and a convert. Um, it's basically me and my buddies, and our questions are really along the lines. Beit Din means literally house of justice. It's a Jewish court, and our focus is not to try and trip you up with what order do you light the Hanukkah candles. Our focus is to understand your journey, and I'm sure those of you who are interested in this process, we've discussed a community baked in Southern California with over 100 rabbis, including representation from all the movements except for Orthodox, for those who want to go that route. And then for those who are interested strictly in a Reform conversion, it makes life simpler because Reform is less rigorous. And so we can go that right as well. For both men and women, there is a mikvah, which is an immersion. This is actually a photograph of the mikvah at the American Jewish University in the Sepulveda Pass. It looks like a spa. It's quite beautiful. And I love the idea of mikvah. With COVID, it's been closed most of the last year since March. I think it was open for a brief period of time, and now it's closed once again. So I think even the Beit Din, I haven't actually double checked on this, but I think they're using lakes or any source of living water can serve as a kosher Beit Din. And then if you're converting under Reform auspices, where the focus isn't so much on how kosher is your Beit Din, we can be more flexible, and Reform doesn't even insist necessarily on a Beit Din. And then for a man in traditional Judaism, if the man has not been circumcised, the requirements are Brit Milah. Brit means Brit actually means covenant. Milah means circumcision. So there's a covenant of circumcision. And for men who have already been circumcised, there is a tradition called Hatafat Dam Brit, which means to take a drop of blood from the site of where your foreskin used to be. And once again, in the Reform tradition, I would say that's optional. As always, feel free to jump in with questions. Movements in Judaism. As we'll see, and forgive me for reading, but it's just helpful for me to carry on the discussion. I would say all the movements are authentic. I believe that if all Jews were Reform Jews, it would be a disaster. And I believe if all Jews were in any one of the movements, that would be a disaster. The movements have had most of their significance in the United States and Western Europe. Growing significance, I would say, in Israel and in Eastern Europe, not comparable to Christian sects. Now, there are lots and lots, I think I keep quoting the number, 43,000 different Christian sects, and they don't all get along with each other so well. Now, the members of the Jewish movements don't always get along with each other so well either, but I would say all Jews in all the movements claim the same path. They all focus on seeing a unified Jewish people. They all accept other Jews as fellow Jews. We actually had a discussion on this in a group that I was leading on Monday night. Although I'm a Reform Jew, even the most Orthodox rabbi would recognize me as Jewish because my mother was Jewish. So now what he would say, if he's an Orthodox rabbi, he would definitely be a he. What he would say is, while I'm Jewish, I'm not correctly practicing or teaching Judaism. That my version of Judaism, Reform Judaism, doesn't accurately reflect what Judaism really should be. But if you're born of a Jewish mother, you're recognized as Jewish. I would say where the schism comes in and who is a Jew is if you convert under non-Orthodox circumstances. The Orthodox Judaism would not consider you Jewish. And in Reform Judaism, as I think you know, there is this concept called patrilineal descent, namely that the child of a Jew and a non-Jew is considered Jewish if that child is raised Jewishly, and it doesn't depend on whether the father or the mother is Jewish. One of the major tenets of Reform Judaism is to treat men and women as much as possible as equal. And many Jews, including me, join a congregation based on geographical considerations, on where your friends go, on whether you like the caterer. It's hysterical. When I got married, the first time, my wife and I and her parents went around from synagogue to synagogue to choose a synagogue where we would get married. and it was entirely and exclusively based on the food they served and the way the synagogue looked. And we would go on Saturday nights, and I'm a baby boomer, so every Saturday night there was a Jewish wedding at every synagogue in New York City. So we just go around Saturday nights and taste the hors d'oeuvres. And we got married in a conservative synagogue, and that was probably the first time I had been in a synagogue in 10 years from the day of my bar mitzvah, and probably didn't go in the synagogue again for another 10 years. So most people don't join a synagogue based on theology. And quite often you may not even have that many choices. If you're living in Ventura, you don't have that many choices. If you're living in Los Angeles, you have lots of choices. I don't know how well you can see this. And this, I guess, is 1915 data on the different religious compositions in Israel and in the United States. So in Israel, you have Orthodox, and that consists of ultra-Orthodox, sometimes called Haredi, and just religious, and that could be Sephardic. I mean, we can get into a long discussion on that. And that's about 22%, and the rest are non-Orthodox. Non-Orthodox, sometimes called Chiloni or secular. I'm sorry, Chiloni, secular, about half of Israel. And in 29%, I would say this is mainly Sephardic, Masorti. No, it could be, no, I'm sorry, it could also be Reform and Conservative. In the United States, you can see the breakdown. Orthodox about 10%, non-Orthodox 90%, Conservative, Reform, other denominations, and no denominations. So one of the things that we learn in Israel is that if the choice is to be observant or not, most people will choose to be non-observant. And particularly in Israel, where people feel very Jewish anyway. In the United States, in order to feel Jewish, or really to cement your Jewish feelings, relationships, connections, people will join a community. And for the most part, that is a non-Orthodox community. So I'm going to briefly go through an overview of the different movements. Believe it or not, the Reform movement is the oldest movement. It was formed in the early 1800s to meet a specific need. Before then, people were just Jews. There were Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But as a particular organized movement, Reform Judaism is the first. And it's basically, I guess I don't have this in there, the reason to form the Reform movement was, particularly in Germany, Germany started accepting Jews as citizens and as part of the populace. And this was a new phenomenon in the history of Judaism. Up until this point, everyone, Jews and non-Jews, understood that Jews were a separate people, even a separate nation, living within the context of another nation. So a group of Jews living in Russia, living in Germany, living in Poland, wherever, and we had our own language, we had our own laws, we had our own traditions, and even in many places we were taxed not as individuals, but taxed as a community. Along with the Enlightenment about 200 years ago, we have this brand new phenomenon in Judaism, and creates a problem, which is to say, how do we deal with a world and a community that accepts us? We know really well how to deal with a community and a world that doesn't accept us, how to live apart. But now we're starting to see, 200 years ago, Germany, France, England, the United States, communities that accept us. So a portion of Jews start to say, let's eliminate or change those elements of Judaism that keep us most apart and prevent us from interacting with the larger world. And in many ways, Reform Judaism consciously copies Protestant Christianity. So let's see. So here are some of the major doctrinal changes. adopting decorum, the idea, if you go to a traditional Jewish service, everybody is praying, people are going at their own pace. Occasionally, the leader will, in a loud voice, start reading the beginning or an end of a prayer, and then people kind of catch up or slow down. But by and large, we're all doing our own thing, and we know when to say Amen and a few other congregational responses. But it's not terribly organized. And if two people are sitting in the back discussing politics and just occasionally chime in with an amen, that's perfectly okay. In fact, if they do nothing other than just be present and not, interrupting, that's perfectly okay. Reform Judaism, copying Protestant services, probably Catholic also, introduced this idea of decorum. We're going to sit here, the clergy is going to sit there, we'll have our prayer books, there'll be some indication of what the clergy says, some indication of what we say, and we're going to be respectful. It's a new concept in Judaism. We're going to have prayer and sermons in the vernacular, which is to say, of course, in German or in Polish and Russian or whatever. Whereas before, services would always and only be in Hebrew, except for those prayers that are in Aramaic. Other traditional doctrines that change is the focus on Israel is reduced. We're starting to appear to the world and be understood by the world as a separate religion rather than a separate nation. So the attachment to Israel in the early stages of reform, and I would say up to the Holocaust, becomes a matter of debate, and it's certainly reduced. Rationalism replaces mysticism, and Judaism comes very scientific. There is, I guess I don't have it here, there's less focus or reduced focus on external signs of being Jewish. So keeping your head covered all the time, wearing long side locks, wearing prayer shawls and fringes and so on. Those kind of go by the wayside. Along the lines of the rationalism is that the concept of a messianic age, some point in the future when things will be very good or even perfect, replaces the idea by and large of an individual Messiah, someone who will be anointed, who will be a king of Israel, and maybe even introduce, quasi-magical or actually magical times. The concept of eternity of the human soul replaces bodily resurrection. And this has an influence on the prayers that we say even in the Hebrew. There is a focus more on the Bible and especially the prophets who are preaching social justice, and a reduced emphasis on Talmud and strict detailed observance. And I would say the major issue is that individual conscience and informed choice becomes paramount, particularly, and I would say, in ritual issues. Jewish ethics is still binding on Jews and ethical teachings and ethical laws. But ritual laws, I keep saying this over and over again, do you keep your head covered all the time? Do you keep strictly kosher? Are you strictly observant of the Sabbath? Those are all ritual issues. Those are really the subject of individual conscience and informed choice. The way I like to put it is, do you hear God speaking to you in these rituals? It is Reform Judaism, not Reformed ED Judaism, because we're not done yet. We keep reforming. And, some time ago, Reform Judaism would prohibit, let's say, men in a synagogue wearing a head covering or wearing a prayer shawl, because it had this emphasis on reducing these kind of ritual outer trappings. I would say Reform now is far more accepting in both directions, in being not so observant and also in being more observant. So, you will see, I go to Reform rabbi meetings, and many Reform rabbis are putting on tefillin every morning. The individual idea of Reform Judaism in the United States, which started, I guess, in the 1860s, 1870s, was the idea that Isaac Mayer Wise, who's the father of Reform Judaism in this country, had this concept that he was going to create a brand of Judaism to bring all the movements together. So the names of the organizations he created. I mean, my school, I'm actually wearing the T-shirt, but it's in Hebrew, is Hebrew Union College, to bring all the Hebrews together. The Union of American Hebrew Congregations, and that's the congregational organization, was recently changed to the Union for Reform Judaism. And the Rabbinic Association is the Central Conference of American Rabbis. But it quickly became clear that other Jews were not going to join us, particularly when on the first celebratory dinner in 1875, when the first Reform rabbis were ordained, they served shrimp cocktail, and that pretty much chased away the rest of the rabbis. So just some illustrations. This is the congregational organization, and you'll see a lot of social justice, Black Lives Matter, gay pride. This is a shot of the women of the wall fighting for women's rights in the land of Israel. This is very typical, I would say, of the Reform Jewish world. Any questions about Reform Judaism as a movement? Okay. So Orthodox traditional Judaism, I would say most Orthodox Jews would say that's what Judaism has been all along. But as a movement, it only begins in response to Reform Judaism. I don't know why I'm all of a sudden nervous about whether I'm recording. I think I am recording. Orthodox Judaism would teach Jewish law is binding and unchanging. That once a Jewish law is made, it never changes, but we do have to adapt Jewish law to the times. And the example I always give on this is electricity. Clearly, you're not going to find electricity discussed in the Bible or in the Talmud. So when electricity comes into play, the rabbis are going to sit down and figure out what is electricity, and pretty much they decide it's fire. So all the traditional laws relating to starting a fire and stopping a fire and so on, we're going to apply to electricity, so you don't turn a light switch on or off during Shabbat. And there's Sabbath elevators and Sabbath refrigerators and so on. And this, of course, is a somewhat controversial subject, but men and women are separate and have distinctly separate roles. So many of us outside the Orthodox world would look inside and say women are treated as lesser and even abused. I would say inside the Jewish world, they would say women are treated as an elevated spiritual status. But separate, clearly not equal. The question is more than or less than, and so that's controversial. It is definitely not monolithic. There are lots and lots of different groups of Orthodox Jews. There's Hasidic, modern Orthodox. The Hasidic typically are fundamentalist, and they each have their own schools, yeshivas for training rabbis. They will each have their own rabbis. They will have their own techniques for certifying which foods are kosher and details of Jewish law. Travis, you're muted. Travis, you're muted. Or you're miming.
Okay. What is the difference between modern Orthodox and centrist Orthodox?
I would say modern Orthodox and centrist Orthodox are the same.
Okay.
Or if there's a difference, I'm not sensitive to what that difference is. There are congregational organizations. So I think the Union of Orthodox Congregations, I think that's modern Orthodox. So Chabad will have its own group. I'm just going to lower your hand, Travis. And they have different rabbinic organizations. Rabbinic Council of America, I think, is modern Orthodox, and other groups. And Hasidic sects, Chabad and so on, typically don't participate in rabbinic organizations outside of their own. Even There's something called the Southern California Board of Rabbis, of which I am a member, which has representatives from all the movements, including Orthodox and also unaffiliated rabbis, but Chabad doesn't participate in that. And then you don't hear about this too much anymore. There was, for quite a while, you would hear about a Baal Teshuvah. In fact, in the Jewish world, they would even call them BTs. And Baal Teshuvah literally means the master of return. It's Jews that have become newly Orthodox. So folks like you and I growing up in Judaism get attracted into the Orthodox world for one reason or another, and they become Baalei Teshuvah. Within the world of Orthodox Judaism, there is a subset of Hasidic Orthodox. That movement begins around 1700 with a Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, who is known by an acronym, the Baal Shem Tov, which literally means the master of the good name being understood as God, so someone with an intimate relationship with God. And he begins a new movement in Eastern Europe, and the focus of the movement is let's see, it's heavily spiritual and Kabbalistic. In its early days, it gets away from a lot of text study and intellectual work and more into sort of ecstatic worship of God. So you have the niguns. Niguns are songs that go and so on, dancing the hora. I think behind me, no, those guys don't look particularly joyous and dancing. So anyway, it's a very joyous movement. Very quickly, it becomes a heavily Talmudic and scholarly movement. Some people would call this the first Reform movement, reforming the idea that you had to be a scholar to relate to God. There are wonderful stories of, a little boy playing the flute in the synagogue and people criticizing him, and the Baal Shem Tov saying, the flute is the music, the notes of the flute is what carried our prayers up to heaven. So there's lots of beautiful stories about going into the woods and worshiping. The disciples of the Besht, of the Baal Shem Tov, create their own movements in different cities in Eastern Europe. And so what you have is a Rebbe, which is different from rabbi. The Rebbe of Hasidic movements are the spiritual leaders of these movements, and they're understood to be spiritual geniuses with a particular connection to God. And the rule is, the standard is that this is a hereditary position. So the child of a Rebbe would become another Rebbe. And of course, since most people in Chabad and in the Orthodox world have many children, one of the big issues is which child. Although one of the interesting things about Chabad is the Rebbe that died some years ago, his father-in-law had no male children, so he was selected as a son-in-law, and then he died before, I think he didn't have any children either, and he died before naming a successor. So that's a very interesting issue in Chabad as to what's going on with the succession. What Chabad then is just one group of about 20 or so different Hasidic groups. It's sometimes called Lubavitches because they come from the city of Lvov. And typically the movements in Chabad are named after the cities in Eastern Europe from which they derive. So some images. This is definitely, this looks Hasidic to me. This looks a little more modern Orthodox. If you look really closely, you can see Mom is wearing a wig. So in the Ashkenazi Orthodox world, married women don't have their hair displayed. So they would cover it either with a kerchief or cover it with a wig, which seems really focused on the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law, particularly since some of these wigs are very expensive and quite beautiful. And of course, it is well known that that the Kushner family is also modern Orthodox. So they have, I would say, even less outward trappings of being Orthodox. I don't believe that Jared keeps his head covered most of the day. Okay, the conservative movement, another major movement in the United States, began, I need to update the slide, early last century, in the early 1900s in the United States as a reaction to the Reform movement. So these were primarily people coming from Eastern Europe in the great wave of immigration, late 19th century, early 20th century. You have this great wave of immigration from Eastern Europe. And the Reform movement, they weren't quite ready to deviate as far from traditional Judaism as Reform, but they had to make accommodations to the need to work. Many of them had to work on Saturdays. So the conservative movement begins in the United States. What I would say is the hallmark of conservative Judaism is that Jewish law is binding, but the laws change with the times. And actually, that is also true with Orthodox Judaism, except in the world of Orthodox Judaism, we live with the myth that all of the changes were given to Moses on Mount Sinai. And as we develop over time, we're just rediscovering those changes. I would say conservative Judaism is less self-conscious about that. So they will make, changes based on their analysis of texts. And so some examples would be you're allowed to drive to synagogue on Shabbat, but the nearest synagogue, not necessarily your synagogue. They eventually allowed women to become rabbis. In most conservative synagogues, but not all, women and men sit together in the sanctuary, whereas in the Orthodox world, men and women are typically seated separately. The services are quite similar to Orthodox. There's a congregational organization, the United Synagogue, and a rabbinic organization, the Rabbinical Assembly. There are two major schools in this country to train rabbis. One is American Jewish University on the West Coast, and then I can't remember the one on the East Coast. I just can't remember. There are other movements. We have discussed them, I think, from time to time. A much smaller movement, about 3%, I think, of congregations, are the Reconstructionist movement. This is a movement founded in the 30s, and the big difference between Reconstructionist Judaism and other movements is that Mordechai Kaplan, who was a conservative theologian, didn't accept the idea of a personal God, a God that relates to us as individuals, that we relate to as an individual. He thought God more as this force in the universe that tends to goodness and redemption. Interestingly, that movement begins by being very observant of Jewish law, because the teaching then is that Judaism is a culture that deliberately focuses on that movement toward redemption and salvation and goodness. And so Jewish law is the glue that keeps us together. So it becomes a halachic movement, one that really embraces Jewish law. But one of the interesting things about Reconstructionist Judaism is they're continually reconstructing themselves. So, and because they're small, they are flexible in changing things. So most of you, if you're familiar with Jewish prayer, you know that, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago, we added Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah to our prayers, which were traditionally only Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That movement began in the Reconstructionist movement, or that idea begins in the Reconstructionist movement. They also came up with this concept, which I think is kind of a nice phrase, which says in these movements, in Reconstructionist movement and Reform adopts the same idea that Jewish law gets a vote, but not a veto. So Jewish law is something that we think about, but we don't necessarily consider binding on us. And I always like to admit that the Reform movement steals many of the best ideas from the Reconstructionist movement. There is a much newer movement called Jewish Renewal. And like Reform, it is not so focused on being strictly observant. And like Hasidism, it is very much focused on prayer and spirituality and mysticism and Kabbalah. So it's a very interesting mix. I sometimes think of it as a cross between Reform and Hasidic Judaism. And so that's much smaller. Okay, so those are the movements. Any questions about movements before we jump into? Yes, Carson.
Did you say that Jared Kushner is modern Orthodox?
Yes. Well, yes, he says he's modern Orthodox.
Okay, because Ivanka Trump they're married, but to my understanding, she's not Jewish. So I didn't
She's converted.
There was.
She was converted.
Oh, she is.
Yeah, she definitely converted, and she converted under Orthodox auspices.
Gotcha. I was just wondering whether or not their marriage would be recognized by the Orthodox movement.
Yes, absolutely. Once you convert, you are Jewish. And in fact, I didn't say this, but there's a tradition that you're not even supposed to remind a convert that they have converted. So a convert is completely and fully Jewish.
If the children of the mother were born prior to conversion, does that change anything, or once the mother converts?
If they're born prior to conversion, they are not born of a Jewish mother. They're not Jewish.
I see. Okay.
So yes, Deborah, you're muted too.
Can you give me a couple of words describing the difference between Orthodox modern and Orthodox regular and fundamentalist? I don't know the difference.
Okay, so if imagine a Venn diagram, and you have, Orthodox and non-Orthodox, and now we're inside the world of Orthodox. I would say there are two groups: ultra-Orthodox and modern Orthodox. Okay. In the ultra-Orthodox world, this, you may or may not be familiar, the ultra-Orthodox is divided into two large groups also, Hasidic and Mitnagdim. I don't know if you've ever heard of Mitnagdim. But they have different style hats. One of my teachers would say they wear Elliot Ness looking hats rather than Stremels or rounder hats. The word Mitnagdim comes from a Hebrew word which means against. And who are they against? The Hasidim. So in the early days of Hasidut, there was a reaction in the ultra-Orthodox world that rejected this idea of lots of singing and dancing the Hora and sort of mysticism, and really just wanted to focus on more traditional observance. So it's kind of hard to tell them apart if you don't have a practiced eye, and I don't. So those are both ultra-Orthodox. You could call them ultra-Orthodox. As another term, Charedim, which I think comes from the same word as tremble, people who tremble before God. In modern Orthodox, they are a little more adapting to the times. So here's a perfect example, and one of my favorites. In traditional Judaism, you are not allowed to shave your beard. Okay. Well, if you look at Jared Kushner, he's clean shaven. So what's up with that? The answer is he uses an electric razor. Okay, this is a great example of Talmudic thinking. What is the essence of shaving? How does shaving cut the hairs on your face? This is a question. It's not a hard question. You drag a blade across your face and it clips the hairs, right? So that's forbidden. You are permitted in Orthodox Judaism to cut your hair with a scissor. Okay? So how does a scissor cut hair? Two blades which pinch the hair, right? So now what is an electric razor? An electric razor a razor or a scissor? This is Introduction to Rabbinic Talmudic Thinking 101. And you have to explain your answer. Show your work.
All I know is that when I go to a dinner at a modern Orthodox house, I am so uncomfortable that it might as well be an Orthodox house to me. I don't
It
know
is an
the
Orthodox house. You said it might
Yeah.
as well be Chabad.
Yeah, I don't
Yes,
know. the
okay.
difference.
That's I understand
Okay,
that.
maybe
because
it's too long an explanation. Thank you anyway. It's good.
No. Anybody want to take a crack at that? What's the difference whether an electric razor is a scissor or a razor?
Isn't it two blades that rub together?
And therefore,
And so they would
Scissor.
technically be like a scissor?
yeah, so an electric razor is a scissor, and in the modern Orthodox world, you can use an electric razor, but not on Shabbat, of course. But during the week, you can use an electric razor. Whereas in Chabad, they might let you use a razor to trim your beard, but they would insist that you have a beard. So it's different Orthodox movements will have different rules. Sorry, that's just my favorite example. I can't help myself.
Where do the fundamentalists come in? Who are they? Never heard of them.
I would say ultra Orthodox are fundamentalists. I mean, there is no movement
Another
called
word.
There is no Jewish movement called fundamentalist, but I'm describing ultra Orthodox as fundamentalist Judaism.
Thank you. Thanks for the answer.
That's why I'm here. Okay, so then there's another major division between of Jewish cultures called Ashkenazim and Sephardim. And this is a simplified explanation. So if we go back to 586 BCE, the Babylonians conquer Israel, destroy the temple, and cart the Jewish leadership off to Babylon. 50 years later, Cyrus of Persia conquers Babylon and allows the Jewish leadership to return. But many Jews are very happy, thank you very much, we will stay in Babylon. So you have, broadly speaking, two groups of Jews. They talk to each other, and in fact, they're going to create two Talmuds, a Yerushalmi, a Talmud created in the Holy Land, and a Babylonian Talmud created in Babel, in Babylon. The Jews that go back to the Holy Land come under Roman rule and Christian rule. And by and large, they hang out with the Christians. The Jews that stayed in Babylon come eventually under Muslim rule, and they hang out with the Muslims. Technically, Sephardim are a subgroup of those that trace themselves back to Spain, and there's a larger group called Mizrahi. I don't think you need to worry about it, but by and large, two different cultural movements. They are all considered Jews. You've heard me discuss this enough time, you probably know that my wife is Moroccan. And so she grew up in Casablanca in Morocco, and her ancestors left Spain in 1492. She is definitely Sephardic. There is zero issue other than cultural issues about an Ashkenazi Jew marrying a Moroccan Jew. They both, we both consider ourselves Jewish. And some of the differences are the ways we pronounce Hebrew. So the Sabbath can be called Shabbat. That is a Sephardic pronunciation. The Ashkenazi pronunciation is Shabbos. The prayer shawl can be a talit, Sephardic, talis, Ashkenazi. And it's just a different way of pronouncing Hebrew. And when I went to Hebrew school, I learned the Ashkenazi way of pronouncing Hebrew. And these days, I would say everyone except for the Chassids teach the Sephardic way of pronouncing Hebrew. And it's a way of having solidarity with the land of Israel. I think after the 6-Day War, maybe even after the Holocaust, I don't know, but certainly after the 6-Day War, it'd be the 6-Day War. After the 6-Day War, the Reform movement, at least, and the conservative movement, as a sort of statement of solidarity with Israel, started teaching Hebrew the way it is spoken in Israel Israel, since it was a Muslim land, adopted the Sephardic pronunciations. And then there's a folk, the folk language in the Ashkenazi world is Yiddish, a mixture of German and Hebrew. In the Sephardic world, we hear a lot of Ladino, which is a mixture of Spanish and Hebrew. So this is certainly my own prejudice in the idea that all the movements are authentic. And there were different groups of Jews in biblical times. You had the Kohanim, the priests, the Leviim, the attendants of the priests, and everybody else, which were called Yisraelim, the Israelites. Today, I would say each of the movements has certainly a distinctive approach and a distinctive role in the mission of Jews accomplishing the goal of being Jewish in the world. So the world of Orthodox Jews make the rest of us continually question every time we move away from tradition and make us reconsider that. They keep the sacred texts alive. They really created Jewish day schools where kids just go to Jewish schools and not secular schools at all. But by and large, the Orthodox reject interaction with the non-Jewish world, particularly on the plane of religious ideas. There's even some in the ultra-Orthodox world who would not be terribly open even on things like charity drives and so on. I would say that is changing, but it, one of my passions, I think, as many of you know, is interfaith discussions, and in the Orthodox world, that is definitely frowned upon. The idea that an Orthodox Jew would want to engage with Christians or Catholics or Muslims to compare and contrast religion is not accepted. And then, as I mentioned this earlier, in a world where the choices between orthodoxy and nothing, such as modern Israel, about 80% of Jews choose nothing. The conservative movement is the one movement that really struggles with Jewish law. The Orthodox movement doesn't struggle with Jewish law. The rabbis make the laws, and they hand down the laws. Occasionally, they may have to interpret a new law, but they would never go back and change a law once it is made. So there's really not much struggle. You might have to struggle with, how do I keep my home kosher? How do I kosher a kitchen? How do I, do X, Y, and Z? But the question of, well, should we really keep this level of kashrut? In the Orthodox world, that doesn't arise. In the Reform world, that doesn't arise either, for the most part, because by and large, with respect to traditional Jewish law, with ritual law, the rule is do your own thing, and it's okay with us. So the Reform are not struggling with Jewish law. The Orthodox are not struggling with Jewish law. Conservative Judaism really struggle with Jewish law, and every time they will seek to make a change, they will go through very detailed, careful analysis on why the change should be made. So that's an important so I say, as a result, there's a heavy emphasis on the scientific study of Judaism. Judaism is a rational religious movement, its history, its logic. The biggest problem, I would say, is lack of passion and spirituality. And I think that's a critique in both the conservative world and in the Reform world. The Reform movement, I would argue, is critical since most Jews are not going to be halachic. They're not going to be observant of Jewish law. In Israel, this isn't such a big deal because the average Israeli, Jewish Israeli, feels Jewish enough because they're living in Israel. They're speaking Hebrew. Their Shabbat is a special day in Israel. Even if you're not observant, you may not observe it, but it's a unique day of the week. There's Jewish holidays become the national holidays. In the United States, if you're not going to be observant, the question is, how do you relate to the Jewish world? So the Reform movement, I would say, particularly in this country, in North America, is a way for people to be passionately connected to Judaism without necessarily having to be halachic, which is to say, worried about all the details of Jewish law. And it's also the one movement that focuses on interaction with the non-Jewish world. So, you know, again, that is a particular passion of mine. And I speak to a lot of Christians, including Catholic programming that often happens on Saturday. And I'm the first rabbi that has been willing to do that, because the other rabbis, I guess, that they approached, maybe they weren't so aware of Reform rabbis, wouldn't come out to their teacher training sessions on Shabbat. And I will, so that's something I do quite a bit. The biggest problems is lack of boundaries, lack of concept of sin, lack of authority. And the challenge for Reform is to produce serious religious Reform Jews. By religious, I mean connected and passionate, but not necessarily observant. I would draw a distinction between the words observant and the word religious. I always point out, you've probably heard me say this, that the word religion comes from the same root word as the word for ligament. It's that which connects us. So, so those are the way I think all the movements are connected. I remember in Israel, having this discussion with some of my Reform rabbis in training, and I remember a discussion, I think, with a young woman, and her attitude was, no, the world would really be better off if all Jews were Reform Jews. I absolutely would not share that point of view. Okay, that actually brings me to the end of my discussion tonight. I do have a few more things to say. Next class is our last class, a week from tonight. And I'll be discussing sexuality, and also bring your own questions. And if you want to email me questions about something that you're wondering about, I know we do this with our little converts group, but also I encourage you, you can email me a question or just raise them as they occur to you. And I want to mention, I have sent this out in an email to all of you. In February, every Tuesday in February and the first Tuesday in March at 7 o'clock, this same Zoom room, I'm going to be teaching a class on the mythology of Judaism. And, you know, the angels, the Garden of Eden, the Messiah, hell. I'm actually just beginning to go through this in great detail. So I actually don't know what I'm specifically going to cover. The angel of death, Lilith. Lilith is a great, a couple of people have indicated they want to focus on Lilith. And the Shekhinah, the bride of God. There is absolutely a feminine mythology, or let me put it this way, a mythology of the feminine aspects of God. And it really reads a lot like God has a bride, God has a wife. And so it's really a lot of fun. It's based on this book called Tree of Souls by Howard Schwartz. And the book is a very scholarly investigation. The introduction, I do it in Roman numerals, I think is almost 50 pages and has 172 footnotes. And that's just the introduction. So I love that, because one of the things I love about a scholarly piece of work is that it tells me where the texts are coming from, rather than just a collection of stories, which are kind of fun. I'm very curious about where the texts are coming from and who's the author and so on. So I hope many of you will join me if you go through study withdrawal in February. And then on the subject of both COVID and politics, there's a Jewish myth, and I may have told you this story in the past, I can't remember. So there's a myth about King Solomon, who supposedly was the wisest of kings. And when he went to the throne, he decided that he needed something to help him. And he asked the royal jeweler to make him a ring. And the ring would have the quasi-magical properties of lifting his spirits when times were bad and bringing him down a few notches when times were good. I guess today we would call that lithium, but I never thought about that before. but this is the legend, and it's actually, this legend is in a lot of different mythical traditions. The jeweler travels the world talking to the great scholars and so on, and finally, the day before he's due to come, he meets a little old guy who says, "This is your ring," and it's actually a ring that I wear. I don't know if it'll focus. Sometimes, yeah, there we go. So yeah, so it says in Hebrew, "Gam ze ya'avor," this too shall pass. And since I bought this ring about a year and a half ago in Israel, I've always loved that story. And sure enough, in Israel, they finally caught on to start selling these rings. And I really don't like jewelry. I don't wear any other jewelry, but this ring I wear all the time. And COVID and the current political craziness that will also pass. So I, for one, look forward to the time when it will. And let me go back off sharing and ask if any questions or comments or anything. And go back to CNN or Fox or MSNBC, depending on which side of the couch you get off, which side of the bed you get off of. Yes.
One question did occur to me.
Yes.
When did the reform movement break away from a Zionist approach? Or
actually,
go towards it? Excuse me.
Yeah, going towards it. My impression is, my very strong impression is that it's after the Holocaust. Whether reform should be Zionist was a huge controversy before that. And in fact, the actual name, if you look at the actual name of my school, it's Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. See it there?
Yes.
There were two colleges, there were two seminaries in the reform movement. And Hebrew Union College was, I would say, broadly speaking, anti-Zionist. And the Jewish Institute of Religion, which was in New York City, was very much Zionist. I'm pretty sure I have that right. And then I think after the Holocaust, everyone was Zionist. I don't think there is a anti-Zionist movement. There may be individual, reform rabbis who are, I would say, the reform rabbis that are much more pro-peace and open to Palestinian rights than others, left wing. But I don't know of any reform rabbis that would argue that Israel should not have the right to exist. And ultimately, that's the essence of Zionism. And before that, it was, well, we're Jews. I mean, just like Catholics, they may like the idea of Rome, and I don't know, Protestants may like the idea of wherever, their particular branch of Protestantism come from, if they're maybe from Great Britain and so on, but no deep connection to those lands in the way Judaism has always had a very deep connection to the Holy Land. So in early days of reform, that was something that was resisted by a major element of reform. Yeah, it's a
Thank you.
Good, you're welcome. Okay, so hearing nothing, I'm sure nothing of interest will happen in the world of politics between now and next Wednesday. I remember thinking, some of you are old enough to maybe have shared this thought, after Watergate was resolved and Nixon resigned, I remember thinking, what are we going to do for news? Because Watergate so dominated, some of you will remember this, it dominated the news, and then it was gone, and somehow we came up with something. So we'll probably come up with something. And hopefully a major element of that is everyone getting vaccinated. So I wish you a good week. Hang in there. Shabbos is coming.
I have a private question for you. Can I talk to you after?
Sure. Let me cut off the recording.